Sorry, well, that's always bad.
Vegas.
So we just.
Yeah, I think we're gonna go.
I think we're gonna close that.
Yeah, moving is good. Yeah, it should be good to. Does the clicker work?
It does. Okay, we're good to go.
Yes.
All right, so we'll kick off with the next part of the presentation. So as Lizzie mentioned, I'm Bob Lockie. I'm from Cal State Fullerton. So that's over on the West Coast. I don't sound like I'm from Cal State Fullerton because I'm originally from Australia, but I've been out here for about 8 years or so now, 8 or 9 years. So it's been a while. So I'm going to talk about some of the research that we've done. Dr. Rawl obviously talked a lot about the research, so I don't want to rehash too much of that, but introduce a few new concepts. And again, like Dr. Rawl, Joe has talked about differences between recruits and incumbents, and that's directed a lot of the research that we've done in the past. I mean, my partnership started with Joe because his question was trying to figure out more about attrition. And that's basically where I came in to dive into some of the potential differences in fitness. Dr. Rawls talked about the links between fitness and job task performance as well. Some of what I'll probably talk a little bit more about is especially looking at the incumbents and some of the research we've done in that particular space, especially considering fitness changes in the career. And especially if you're considering or looking at doing any type of fitness assessments for incumbent officers, some of the considerations that have to tie into that. And we've talked a little bit about this, and I think something to consider, especially at the academy level, is how is fitness training being used? And I think that's important. Yes, it's there to hopefully improve the fitness of your candidates, but in a lot of cases, it's also there to impart some type of physical discipline as well. And that influences the importance of training too. Dr. Rawls talked about the cumulative stress that happens within academy. And it's not just the fitness training, it's not just the skills training, it's the other stuff that happens in and around that. It's getting two different buildings on the training side. It's also the psychological stress. Dr. Orr mentioned this before as well. There is a tangible physiological response that happens with stress. That graph over there on the right of the screen, that was basically some heart rate monitoring that we took from custody assistant recruits during their first day of academy. So that was where there was very little physical activity. There was a lot of psychological stress imparted by the training staff, and the responses for the most of the candidates within that class was equivalent to a high intensity exercise or a hard exercise session. They're getting heart rates of in between 76 to 95% of their max heart rate, which would be equivalent to a challenging exercise session. And that's without any type of physical activity on top of that. As far as looking at fitness testing and looking at results, and again, Dr. Rawl mentioned this, a large part of what might pop as being important is dependent on what type of training modalities are used. And that showed up a lot of our research with the Sheriff's Department is at the time, there were a lot of muscular endurance exercises, a lot of running. So naturally enough, muscular endurance tests, aerobic fitness were important for those candidates. I think something, and again, Dr. Earl touched on this before as well, something that's important to consider, especially at that academy level, is just because you have a fitter candidate does not always guarantee success. You may have someone that is, identified as potentially being at risk, and they make it through the training academy. You might have someone that looks like a complete star with their fitness testing, and then they don't make it through. And so I think that is the challenge of the creation of cut scores is you may lose some people that would actually make it through depending on your training approach. And I think that's important, and Dr. Dawes will talk about that, especially with ability-based training. Joe talked about that previously as far as meeting candidates where they're at, is that you might have someone that comes in at lower fitness, but depending on your training modality, you can train them up to the standard that you want. And I think that's important to keep in mind when you're looking at fitness testing, especially at that academy recruit level, as fitness is one piece of the puzzle. Dr. Orr talked about skill development as well. Like that's an important concept too. The psychological stress that comes in, how someone tolerates that psychological stress is also going to be part of that puzzle as well. And I think this was some interesting data that came from Dr. Dawes and a partnership that he had with a law enforcement organisation, where they actually separated the recruits by sex. And what they actually showed is that the males that did not make it through academy still had higher fitness scores than some of the females who actually graduated from academy. And so, again, on the surface, that's an interesting result in and of itself. And I'll take a quote from another one of our colleagues in the past, where his description was that if he had a recruit or a candidate that was sloppy with their fitness, it was potentially they were sloppy in other areas of their life. And so there are other indirect benefits potentially from having candidates that are demonstrating better fitness. And this will kind of tie into some of what I'll talk about later on, especially as it relates to incumbents, when we look at life organization. Like, how can you actually fit in time with your exercise? And if you have a recruit that can actually fit exercise within their schedule, there's a good chance that they can fit in their study and what else they need to do within their schedule as well. The other point as well is with fitness, another potentially indirect, is their recovery from other aspects, the other stress that's occurring during academy. You know, if you're coming in less fit, you might be tired from training. Does that fatigue then affect how well you study and prepare for the next exam that you have? And so that's another potential indirect, impact of that lesser fitness. And I think to Joe's point earlier on, if you know your incoming classes are not necessarily as fit as historically an organization might have seen, can you maximize what you have from your cadet class, or your recruit classes? And I think Joe in particular will talk about that. Melissa will talk about that with how they're adapting their fitness training programs as well, is because it's meeting the individuals where they're at. It's not, you can be upset all you want that there's less movement literacy, which is true. I see that at the collegiate level, just with, I teach in kinesiology, and I see students who are not as physically active and not as coordinated as they potentially should be. So I can be angry about that, or I can recognize, all right, if this is where we're at, this is what we need to do to actually get you to the level which would be acceptable. And I think again, Dr. Earl touched on the range of different physical fitness qualities. What's interesting, and we found this within the research, and you probably see this within populations, is that you'll often have individuals that are generally pretty good at everything. Whether it's fitness testing, whether it's skill development. And I think a big part of that is because, if someone is, at least staying physically active, they'll have some degree of aerobic capacity. They'll have some degree of strength. They'll have some degree of power. And so by having those all-round skills, they tend to be better at a lot of different things. The challenge is, all right, how do we get those folks who might have some limitations, how do we train them up to actually get where we want them to be? And again, Dr. Earl has touched on this, and Joe mentioned this as well, is like the differences in the job task are very important here, especially when we look at fitness testing. This becomes very important for incumbents where, time demands are very different compared to your recruits and cadets. And there are certain standards that most academies will actually have to hit at the end of their training academy. For the incumbent officer, that may not necessarily be the case. And so if you are introducing some type of fitness test or fitness assessment, the background of those folks is going to be very different. And again, Joe touched on this as well, is that you might be able to overcome limitations in fitness on the basis of smarter decision-making that you make. Like 20 years, yes, over the course of 20 years, you're probably going to lose fitness. But over the course of that 20 years, that's 20 years of experience, 20 years of knowledge that you can then use to actually potentially perform that job better as well. And I don't think you can lose sight of that. And this is some survey data that Joe and I have worked on as well. We presented this at IADList, and this was basically doing a survey of how many states actually had standards, both from fitness standards from the recruit all the way up to the incumbent officer. And the great majority of states from post organizations, so we talked to representatives from different posts across the USA, do not have standards that are mandated by post for their incumbent officers. You can see a few examples. There are a state here or there that might have age or gender based, but the great majority do not have standards for their personnel. And so I think that's important to kind of keep in context, especially when you look at some of the data that surrounds this. Dr. Earl touched on this before. So this is some data that we collected from LA County Sheriff's Department, and I was basically looking at deputy sheriffs whose first post was basically working in custody facilities. And so we had groups that worked either We had recruits, we had sheriffs that worked 24 months or less, 25 to 47 months, or greater than 48 months, so greater than 2 years. And they were assessed in the work sample test battery. So job-specific fitness assessments, and what we basically saw was, not surprisingly, fitness tended to get worse. And especially for those folks who spent 2 years working in custody facilities. And this was just prior to, they went through patrol school, so this was just prior to their first patrol post. So they've spent their time during academy training up to be a patrol officer, spent 2 years working in a custody facility, to the extent when their performance in their job-specific fitness assessments has gone down. And there's a lot of research that has shown that fitness of our incumbent personnel tends to decrease, and not just for factors due to age. Dr. Earl talked about that when you look at the other stresses of the profession as well. And so this led to some of the other research that, as in particular I've worked on, and Dr. Earl talked about using research to kind of look at quality control. And this was a big part of some of the research that I did with some other organizations, so Marcy Guzman through Wellness Solutions, where it's looking at the potential effectiveness of health and wellness programs. Because when we're actually looking at fitness assessments, most organizations are not mandating this. So if we see any type of fitness data from officers, typically it's coming through health and wellness programs. And so these programs, for the most part, are voluntary. And in a lot of cases, which will become important with what I talk about a little bit later on, they're incentivized. So that's the motivation potentially for some folks to be involved. The other thing to keep in mind, especially when you look at any health and wellness program data, is what's referred to as the healthy worker effect. In that the folks, if it's voluntary, the folks who are more likely to participate are probably more likely the ones who are exercising and fit. The ones who you really want to get to participate because it's voluntary, for whether or not they just don't like physical activity, whether or not they just don't want people to know that they haven't been training, they're not going to be participating within this particular program. But at the same time, what's important, especially for organizations like this, is to be able to show, hey, is our program actually being effective? Is it helpful? And so this is interesting to know. Oh, I've lost it.
Sorry.
There we go. So this is a wide range of fitness data that came from this particular health and wellness program, tracked over 3 years, 2018, 2019, 2020. And what we actually saw was actually very few significant changes across the years of this particular program. Now, on the surface, you might think, oh, that's not ideal, because ideally you would like to see improvements. But at the same time, you got to look at the population that's here. So those years were basically a collection of all the officers who participated within that year. But officers will float in and out of wellness programs, depending on their availability, depending on their position, depending on the injuries, anything like that. All the data was de-identified, as Dr. Earls talked about this previously, so it was really hard to try and match the individual up from year to year. So we looked at it as from a group. However, the important thing to keep in mind is the job is not healthy. The job is not conducive to actually maintaining physical fitness. So if you are basically maintaining or improving physical fitness. So if you can actually maintain the fitness of everyone who's participating within this program, that is a positive. There was some significant changes in 2020 with sit and reach and grip strength. I remember talking to my colleague and she was like, we didn't do anything special in that year to try and target that. But at the same time, if you are having maintenance of fitness, you are alleviating as much as possible the damage of the profession, that's a good thing that you can actually see here. And we can see that from some of the fitness assessments. The other thing, especially with having this type of data from incumbent officers, is potentially if something flags. If there is a change, Joe talked about it, if there is a change in equipment, if there is a change in injury rate that occurs, that's where having this kind of group data on officers can be quite useful. And what was interesting from this sample, so I didn't have injury data, but in 2020, which was a stressful year for a lot of people, they had high blood pressure. Not surprising considering what was happening within that year. But it was interesting to me because it's like, all right, you can see a variable that pops on the basis of something that is happening within that year for the individuals. So again, that gives, as a practitioner, that gives you something to potentially to intervene with. But this gives us a picture of what the officers look like, again, within the context of this is voluntary. And this is important to kind of keep in mind when we actually look at the job itself. And again, Dr. Dawes will talk about some of these factors as far as the job itself not being healthy to the individual, and where fitness assessments can be beneficial depending on how it's actually being used. Because the risk factors associated with the profession, Dr. Orr talked about cardiovascular risk factors as well. And, the value, and this is part of why this research that we did it with looking at the health and wellness program, is it's multifaceted. And the other thing too was like, yes, fitness is maintained, but within that sample, there are individuals that did demonstrate lesser fitness. The positive is they're in the program. So they're in a position where they can actually get some type of intervention. Dr. Orr talked about that traffic light system. That's where that type of system can be useful. So it's not being used for punitive, it's being used for, hey, let's try and make sure you have a successful career and you have a good life when your career actually finishes. Like, it puts you in a position where you can actually intervene. And another thing here too, to kind of keep in mind, because especially with, any type of introduction of fitness assessments for incumbent officers, I think part of the thought process there is to try and encourage some type of behavior change. If we have a fitness assessment, this is going to make people actually do some type of exercise. It is not that simple. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we actually touch on a few things. So this was from a survey that we conducted with incumbent sheriffs. And so there's a lot of data that's up there. A few things that I want to highlight is basically what we looked at is physical activity. So how many sessions per week the individual completed mild, moderate, or strenuous physical activity. We gave parameters for examples of what those actually look like. There was an activity score, which is basically the weighting of how much strenuous, moderate, and mild activity you performed within a week. Then it's how much resistance training you performed within, how likely you were to perform resistance training, how much resistance training you performed on days per week over the past 3 months, and how much you did in the last week. And surprisingly enough, those individuals who are physically active tended to demonstrate some positive measures within fitness. Looking at muscular endurance with 60-second push-ups and sit-ups, lower resting heart rate, which is a positive, some, when we look at waist to hip ratio, so that's a measure of body composition. So not surprisingly, a lot of research shows physical activity can be beneficial to your health. But how do we get someone to actually be physically active? And it's not just as simple as saying, hey, you should do it. We're introducing a fitness test. You are now going to exercise so you can actually meet these standards. Because the issue is now we can touch into motivation. And so we actually did a survey that looked at the motivation of individuals. And if you look at typical law enforcement training at the academy level, it's all external. You are training because you want a job. You are training because you did something wrong and now we're going to punish you. So you're going to do this because we're telling you to. So it's all external. However, there are also different measures of internal motivation. So up there, you can see 4 basically different examples of introjected, identified, integrated, intrinsic. They are all measures of internal motivation. So the individual themselves is actually motivated to actually perform their exercise without the existence of some type of external motivator. So when we look at what are the predictors, or what relates to, I shouldn't say predictors, what relates to physical activity participation, it's basically all the internal motivators. So all the sheriffs who are internally motivated were more likely to be basically performing more strenuous exercise, more physical activity overall, more resistance training exercises. The negative results were basically amotivation. So if you were amotivated, you didn't perform any resistance training, not surprising enough because you don't want to do it. But the driving force here, which caused people to be physically active, was their internal motivation. So how do we tap into that? And we actually look at some of their health measures. Again, what's popping is more of that internal motivation. So those who are internally motivated to exercise will also tend to demonstrate better fitness, which is kind of what you want, ideally. But like I said, the problem is a lot of what's kind of based around encouraging law enforcement fitness is external motivation. Like, you have to do it during a training academy. You have to do it because we're introducing some type of fitness assessment. So how do we actually, and then when we talk about training for the test, if I know you're going to assess me on push-ups, I'm just going to do push-ups because that's what I do need to do to pass. Whereas what we would like is more of a kind of holistic approach. So if we want to encourage some degree of physical activity, how do we encourage that internal motivation? That process really starts during academy. Dr. Dawes is going to talk a little bit about that. Melissa's going to talk about that with the modification she's made to her training program, because another contributing factor here is what's referred to as self-efficacy. So our exercise self-efficacy is our belief in our ability to actually perform exercise. And there are kind of 2 factors that we looked at within this particular survey. is coping, self-efficacy and scheduling. So how effectively, how confident are we that we can overcome any barriers to our exercise participation? And then how confident are we to actually schedule our exercise into our daily life? And so the most common barriers that we found, and not surprising, time. Time's the biggest one. Time, work commitments, family commitments. And so again, when you're actually bringing in any type of fitness assessment, it's within the context of, I don't have time to exercise, or potentially that type of attitude. So again, how can we encourage or provide the individuals with the confidence to actually overcome those barriers? And not surprisingly enough, again, if we see individuals who have greater coping self-efficacy, greater scheduling self-efficacy, that is generally reflected in their fitness test results. They tend to demonstrate better fitness in a few of the different measures that are up there, job specific and push-ups and sit-ups. And I think that's important here too. So what resources are you providing? And so I think that's important, that if you're looking at any type of fitness assessments for incumbent officers, what's the support that's coming along with it? It's not just the fact of, hey, we got a test now, you need to pass it, but what's the support you're actually providing? And that support starts all the way back at academy. When you're actually looking at how are we actually designing our exercise programs? Are we giving you the confidence to actually perform exercise? Are we giving you strategies to actually perform this exercise too? Kind of further to some of the questions that came up during the break, because I've had recent conversations with a colleague who's working for a police department where they're investigating either introducing an hour of physical activity, or an hour of wellness, I should say, either before or after a shift, and what that's going to look like and what needs to be measured to actually show whether or not it's actually being effective. And that's a part of it's like, if we recognize that one of the biggest complaints is I've got a lack of time, sorry, here's an allocation of time where you can actually perform some type of exercise. Here is the support that's being provided within the health and wellness program. So if you don't know what you're doing, there is a trained strength and conditioning coach on site who can help you with that process. If you are confident with doing it, great. Here's the gym, go take care of it. But it's that allocation of time to actually potentially provide that. Because again, that's one of the common critiques, is that I don't have the time, I'm too tired, So what strategies can you teach during academy? What strategies can you provide, or what support resources can you provide to the officers to actually encourage some type of physical fitness development over time, without necessarily just thinking, okay, if we assess it, it's going to encourage people to actually exercise, because it's not always going to work that way. And I will pass over the clicker.
All right, excellent. And guys, if you're okay with it, I'm gonna stand up because I am honestly going stir crazy sitting here. So yeah, so as far as the research elements of this, so these guys have done an amazing job covering some of the initial content to kind of lay the foundation and framework for why fitness is important, why fitness assessment is necessary to translate to not only improve the health but the occupational performance and fitness of your group. So what we're going to kind of turn to now is maybe some practical examples of how we implement these different strategies, and maybe go into a little bit more depth about some of the things we talked about earlier, like ability-based training and things of that nature. So bottom line up front with academy completion, this is not going to be a shocker to anybody, but more fit cadets tend to be better. Thank you for that. But with that being said, in a lot of the research that we've done, what we have tended to see is cadets that score better in a substance of muscular endurance and cardiorespiratory endurance tend to do better during academy. Now, with that being said, that should be looked at with caution. The main reason is because a lot of these academies that we've assessed during their physical training, guess what they do a lot of? Push-ups and running. So it stands to reason that if you are reasonably good at that, you are going to have a reasonably better chance at passing those specific academies. So with the ones that we're talking about in these situations, every single academy is going to have different criteria. I guess it's within the academy, different fitness focuses and emphases. So even though our models tend to work, every academy is going to be a little bit unique and a little bit different. So the one thing I would definitely encourage you not to do is take the exact numbers that we have here, extract those and go, okay, these are our numbers, because it won't work. Okay, it has to be individualized to the group, and those are things that we can help kind of work through and assess. The biggest thing also with that is when you lose cadets, it's a significant cost to the agency. And I think the thing about it is like, we look at the initial upfront cost, in the state of Oklahoma and in Colorado where I've done a lot of work. They said in order to recycle a cadet, it's anywhere from $170,000 to about $200,000 per person. So in, one academy, they were spending close to $1 million a year in loss as far as the number of people that could not complete academy. So it's a significant cost to the agency. I think the thing that is harder to measure, it's not just the cadet, it's what impact does that have on the entire agency? Because now people have to pick up additional shifts, that detracts time from them to engage in their health and wellness. Here in a moment, we're gonna talk a little bit about what the job does to officers, just in, Dr. Luckett made a comment that it's not really conducive to health and wellness. There's nothing about the job that is going to make you more fit. You basically have to undo what the job does to you. So that's one of the things that we really try to emphasize is nothing is conducive to health and wellness. You have to proactively take measures. So even though it's not entirely your fault, you're still responsible, all right? And we do have to make sure that you're able to, perform at a certain occupational level, but also, as we mentioned earlier, stay a healthy, fit human being so you can hopefully enjoy retirement as well. Okay, so we talked about some of the different physical stresses. So, I think one of the things that we need to highlight is whenever a cadets go through training academy, like over the course of their career, there's probably no other time that they're gonna have that much physical stress at one time. Usually, like I said, they're gonna have PT every day. That's gonna be coupled with different types of trainings and tactics that they have to learn. Again, paired with the communal living, not having a support system with them that they would normally have, being away from family. And again, there's still family things that are going on that they don't have control over. We talked about stress and the actual physical stress, but there's also the mental stress that goes along with this. And stress is a super primitive response with what it does to the body. So it's one of those things that whether it's, mental, emotional, psychological, or physical, it's all gonna take a bigger toll when it's all said and done. That's gonna impact how much reserve we have and how much capacity we're gonna be able to get into the different activities that we have as well. Oh, really quick, before I get too far down this road, I am from Oklahoma. I also have an accent, but it's not the kind that people like to hear like that. So I apologize. The more excited I get, the more it comes out. So I'm trying to tone it back down a little bit because I'm excited to be here. So, all right. So talking about some things related to cadet failure. So this is actually some research that we did with One Academy, and what we looked at, and I'm going to try and move this reasonably quick, is first and foremost, they said, hey, we're losing a lot of cadets. We're trying to figure out why. What's the reason? I'm like, well, okay, why do they tend to exit? They said, honestly, if they don't get injured, we pretty much find a way to get them through. So basically that made it a really easy predictive model because they became injured. So, and the great thing about that is like you're injured on this day at this time and it happened. Like there's no debate about that whatsoever. So that made it a very, very clear-cut way to determine, again, how fit do you need to be to not withstand an injury during academy training. So the long story short, this one, and Dr. Orr covered this study earlier, so I won't belabor the details of it, but what we found is like less fit cadets tended to not be able to pass. What we also found is that there was 2 specific tests out of the 4 battery tests that we did that had better predictive value, okay? So, they talked about the 20-meter multi-stage fitness test or the shuttle run. Does anyone know what that is in here? Okay, I didn't think you all did. So, because that's one of those things, it's a little bit more exotic because if you haven't done it, you probably wouldn't know. So basically, it's a 20-meter distance and it goes to an audio cadence. It starts out reasonably slow where you're kind of doing a slow jog, like you can almost kind of walk it if you're reasonably fit. And then as the stages increase, the beats that are keeping your cadence and time get closer and closer together. So by the time you're done, if you can withstand it for a good duration of time, it's kind of an all-out sprint, okay? So you hit the line, you cut it, change direction, you keep moving. So it can get quite intense. So what we saw is that the cadets that tended to pass academy, about 39 shuttles where we saw the divergence line, kind of like what Dr. Orr he was talking about earlier. In addition to that, push-ups were another really good predictor. So right around that 32 push-up mark, we started noticing some kind of interesting things happen. So in short, if you were unable to do at least 39 shuttles, you had about a 40% chance of passing academy. If you did 32 push-ups, or sorry, fewer than 32 push-ups, you had about a 50-50 shot to get through. But if you were poor at both of those, your odds of passing went down to 14%. So what this agency did is they didn't want to draw a hard cut sword in the sand. Instead, what they did is they handed this to recruiters and go, here, whenever you're out doing your assessments, keep this in mind. So it just became another deciding factor with the entire hiring process. Okay, so that didn't mean that they couldn't accept somebody who scored less than this. It just means like, okay, if you do this, you're accepting that risk and, you know, their odds of getting through may be lesser than this other individual. Again, just another hiring decision. Okay, this was also kind of alluded to is lower fitness so lower fitness levels are going to deplete your resources. So as we're talking about, a lot of the academic failures that we tend to see also happen to be with people who don't have very high fitness levels. So I can't say, okay, because you're not fit, you're not gonna be very smart, you can't pass your scores. That doesn't really make sense, right? So basically, what we would assume on that is like, because their fitness levels are lower, they're exhausting a lot more of the resources. And when they actually have to sit down and do academic-based work, cognitively, again, they got resources competing. So they're not able to assess and process things quite as well, which may lead to academic failures as well. So it's one of those things like fitness isn't just about, you know, can you do the thing? It has a much, much broader impact on the entire cadet or the officer as well. Okay, so looking at some different training strategies for cadets. So this is kind of some fun stuff on this. So when we're looking at these different strategies, we talked about bridge programs, okay, or pre-employment programs, if you will. So a lot of times the gap time between when an officer or an individual applies to become an officer and the time they actually get into the academy can be pretty extensive. I've seen as much as anywhere from 6 months to a 1.5 year hiring cycle where people came in and tested a 1.5 years before, and then a 1.5 years. Fitness-wise, they're completely different human beings. So basically, these programs kind of help people stay on track, maintain their fitness, and hopefully elevate that fitness. So when they enter into the academy, they're able to have a better chance of success because they're at a higher fitness level. One of the other things that we see a lot is the one-size-fits-all training approach. And I think this was alluded to earlier by Dr. Ward. But and it was actually brought up on the phone call earlier, so resources. Okay? Resources are an issue. And if you're working with an academy class that has 60 individuals, kind of the easy thing to do is, you know, if you run, if you do push-ups, you do sit-ups, and more calisthenic-based work, you don't have to worry about having a lot of equipment. So there's some charm in doing that. The problem is what tends to happen is we're gonna have different stratifications of fitness levels, right? So let's say if we're all in a class and we've got, you know, Dr. Orr over here who's very fit and Chloe, right? Yeah, Chloe who's moderately fit, and you have me who's very unfit, all right? And we all have to run the same distance. Well, these two didn't have to have as much, they didn't put as much stress on the body as I did because I was working so hard to compete and just to keep up. So basically what ends up happening, what we tended to see is kind of like a norming effect. So what ends up happening is she may get better, okay? Because like I said, she's kind of at the middle of the road. So we're kind of aiming to the middle. Dr. Orr may actually get less fit because maybe he was at a higher level, but he's kind of being pulled back by the moderate, the middle group. And then me being in the unfit category, I'm getting overtrained. So my odds of getting injured go way up. So that's the challenge with those types of models is, again, it violates one of the basic principles of fitness and wellness, which is individualization and progression. So one of the things that we have to account for is everybody is an individual. And we have to adjust and monitor the training program appropriately to make sure that we're adding just the right amount of stress on their body to make sure that there's a positive adaptational response. So on here, I put the Goldilocks principle to make it really easy. So we all remember the story of Goldilocks, right? So not too hot, not too cold, just right. It's the same thing with stress. So we don't want too much stress on the body because it will break. If you put too little stress on the body, it won't adapt. So we're trying to find that sweet spot. So what is the perfect amount of stress to cause a positive adaptation response to set the best foundation possible for them to improve their health and fitness? That also goes back to the motivational aspect of this that Dr. Lockie talked about is if you give them the tools to be successful and they understand how to manipulate their own training programs, that's going to set the stage for them to maintain fitness throughout their occupational career. See how I tied it all back together? Come to you next, Jeff. All right, so Army Combat Fitness Test. Is anybody familiar with this test? Seen this? All right, so this is something that the Army rolled out recently within the last 5-6 years or so, maybe a little bit longer than that. But previously, the Army had their fitness standard, which included a 2-mile run, push-ups, and sit-ups for time. Okay, so by no chance, what did people train for? Push-ups, sit-ups, and run. And they neglected some of the more critical areas of fitness. if you look at the job of a soldier, they gotta become like a athlete, right? They have to be able to be reasonably strong, reasonably, able to endure, and do a whole host of different things. It's not just about endurance. Law enforcement officers are the same way. Okay, if you have to do potentially anything on the job, then you gotta be prepared for anything. So we gotta make sure that they have a good broad base of fitness in, diverging areas sometimes. So again, we need to make sure you're cardiorespiratorily fit enough to recover from different types of, activities. We also need to make sure that you have a reasonable amount of strength and endurance. So if you do have to use force, I have to go hands-on with somebody, you can recover from that and then do the things that you need to do. And also, again, if you do not have fitness as a tool, you are more likely to go to a more lethal tool. So fitness actually is beneficial in much more ways than just the sake of the officer, okay? So the thing about the ACFT, this is what their new fitness test looks like. So, to go through this reasonably quick, this first assessment, the one, on the repetition max, maximum deadlift is a focus on strength. Standing power throw is total body power. Hand release push-up is muscular endurance. Sprint grab carry is an assessment of, anaerobic endurance. So that's gonna be your higher level endurance-based activity. So give or take about 90 to 100% of what your maximum effort would be. And then we have the plank, which is, basically just a static hold that measures trunk stability, and a 2 mile run, which is your measure of aerobic capacity. So the thing about this, I will be honest with you, with the ACFT, the rollout of it has had a lot of controversy. It's a bit of a dumpster fire, but here's the positive, is this is way better than what they had, and it's actually having the right effect on the
Yep.
training process, which is, I think, actually what we care about. Is because I don't necessarily care how many push-ups and sit-ups they can do or how far they can run. I need somebody who is overall well-rounded, who can do all the things that they need to do on the job, and this gets more at the core of that issue. All right, so the infamous ability-based training. So I know when Dr. Orr brought that up, did that make sense earlier what that is, ability-based training? Okay, so basically all that is, using my previous example, is if you have people at varying levels of fitness, you're gonna have to make some modifications to make sure that they, are getting what they need. So, you know, I've worked with a lot of groups before that's like, well, they should be more fit and able to tolerate. Well, great, but they can't. So now what do we need to do? So we have to make that adjustment to make sure that we're getting them what they need to bring them along and make sure that they're able to successfully complete academy. Same thing goes with officers after they become incumbent as well, or once they graduate, is, again, not everybody's built the same, everybody has different challenges, so we have to find different strategies that are gonna accommodate what their needs are to make sure that we're getting the right amount of stress on their body to see those adaptations. But in some research by, actually Dr. Orr and Lockie here, looking at your traditional training programs, that are more calisthenic-based focused, long duration events, and looking at the ability-based training. What they found, in general terms, was it had similar results as far as improvements in fitness, but far less risk of injuries. So again, if you are, I don't know how fit you necessarily need to be a great officer, but I do know if you're injured, that's gonna be a problem. And that's gonna impact your ability to actually be able to do the job. So making sure you stay injury-free is gonna be a huge benefit. So, to show you guys some examples, so these are some examples of some different ability-based training models that we've used. Basically, if you look at this bottom, or this one right here to your right, so this is one we did with our Army ROTC program at Oklahoma State. So we had 4 different ability-based groups, and we actually categorized them using that 20-meter multi-stage fitness test that we talked about earlier, and then we stratified them out into how, you know, what their fitness levels were. So in this particular example, the individuals had 10 seconds to cover a given distance, okay? So basically, the lower fitness group would have 10 seconds to get from that cone to that cone, and they had to cover 40 yards. The more fit group had 45. The next fittest had 50 yards they had to cover, and then the most fit group had to cover 55. So what that does is everybody's working at the same relative intensity, all right? So theoretically, we're all working at 80% of what our max effort is, but the distance is what changes. So that allows us to all train at the same level. If the distances were further and we had the same amount of time, then that would mean that the less fit group may be working at 90, 95%, the middle group may be working at 80%, and then the most fit group is working at maybe 70%. So again, it creates that norming effect. So what this does is instead of basically dragging the group to the middle, we're pulling everybody up. So that's gonna be a really big benefit. This is also another way to organize, is that grid system. That just looks like there's a lot of stuff going on. It's fun to organize, but it takes a little bit more organization. Truthfully, I don't do that with small groups, so. This is some other research that I did several years back, looking at, as far as ability-based training, some of the push-up. Okay, so couple different variations here. So we have the traditional push-up where, you know, you're, in that, partly in rest position or a plank position, and then you go down and do a full, full repetition. On this other version is the modified version where the knees are in contact with the ground. So this was one of those things that kind of helped satisfy curiosity. I'm like, okay, well, how much weight do you push up when you do a push-up? I don't really know. So we put everything on a force plate and we actually measured that. So in general, when we took, male officers, we saw that when they were in the down position of a push-up, they were close to moving about 70 to 75% of their total body mass. When we switched to a modified version, we dropped that by about 10 to 15% of how much load they were actually lifting. So in a situation like that, that could be where everybody starts up in the standard push-up position, if that's what the requirement is, and then when they get fatigued and can no longer continue, they simply drop down, go to a modified position at a lower intensity, but they can still continue to get the volume of training necessary to improve their fitness, okay, instead of just like having to stop. Or in some cases, trying to force them through an exercise that they can't really do, which is gonna increase that risk of injury. Okay. This is another sample as far as with that push-up progression. So we talked about the modified push-up being the most remedial level, the traditional push-up being the one in the center, and then the one at the top is actually a really cool version. So, I know the question came up online about having minimal equipment. Manual resistance is something else that can be utilized as well. So in this, you simply partner people up, they get in the push-up position, and then from this position right here, I can put almost as much load on that person as I need to elicit the adaptational response I'm looking for. In general, if we're trying to develop maximal muscular strength, we would want to try and find a range that would allow to push, maybe about 6 to 8 repetitions, okay? Because that's gonna help develop, strength. So that person that's on the top, all they have to do is apply enough force so they can only complete 6 reps. Now, there's some communication that has to happen there, and people have to be dialed in and do what they're, actually listen to what the person's telling them. But that's one way that you can actually improve strength. So we had an academy class, this was a fire academy, where bench press was one of the assessments they did as a strength test. We had 38 people in that class. So I did not have the ability to put everybody on a bench press. We did this instead, and at the end of the academy, it was over about 16 weeks. On average, they improved about 25 pounds on the bench press, and they never touched the bench press. Okay, so you don't have to have a lot of equipment to do it. You do have to be creative, and I think that's the other benefit of having qualified and certified instructors to help guide and steer these different programs is they hopefully know how to make those adjustments in order to make sure that individuals are getting what they need at the level they need it at. Okay, this is just another example of an ability-based training exercise for the lower body. So again, a body weight squat versus one that has an extra weight attached to it. And then for those that are more advanced, just simply switching to a single leg variation to where they can increase the load on one leg at a time versus spreading out over both. Okay, sorry, that was a lot. So everybody still hanging with me? We're good? All right, awesome. So now going into, we're out of academy now, and now you're an officer. So as I said before, nothing about the job is conducive to health and wellness. So we have to undo what the job does to them. So even though we know that with policing, you may have to have all out sudden burst of maximal to near maximal activity, most of the job is sedentary. Okay, so most of the time you're sitting around waiting for something to happen. And then, from that point, you have to go basically from 0 to hero, right? The other thing that we talked about earlier, I think this was Joe's, I told you I'd get you, talking about metabolic syndrome. So what we have seen is shift workers are 4 times more likely than the general population to get metabolic syndrome or as daytime workers. So just working that shift work, it causes a hormonal cascade that creates a lot of challenges to maintaining health and wellness. So just by working shift work alone, and I think Dr. Orr mentioned, it's a known carcinogen now. So it has been shown to be related to cancer, okay? All right, so here's a slide that people throw up that are researchers that have a lot of information that you can't read. So I'm just gonna cut to the chase. So looking at fitness decline in officers versus the general population. So it says, police officers begin their careers with above average strength, but demonstrate greater declines with age than the general population do. In addition to that, they also demonstrate cardiovascular fitness levels that are below what the American College of Sports Medicine recommends for the general population. So again, putting them at greater risk for different types of health conditions, cardiovascular disease, and other types of comorbidities. And then further to that, body fat percentages tend to surpass what the recommendations are and tend to be higher than what the normal population is, and normal increases with age as well. And then Unfortunately, we do see a natural decrease in lower body power, with the aging process. Some of that's partly due to the normal process of aging, but also some of that's due to the fact that they just don't train it, right? So that it's a perishable skill. If you don't work to maintain power, then that's one of the things that tend to go away the fastest. Out of all the assessments that we do, anything requiring speed or power, we tend to see a greater decline in that over the different age brackets than say like your muscle endurance and strength type test as well. Okay, and then life expectancy within the law enforcement population is significantly worse than the general population as well. So again, I know these are some statistics that probably y'all are aware of and have seen, but I think probably the thing that we don't do probably a great job of, is explaining why this happens. So that's what we're gonna get into really quickly, is looking at what is the biological rationale for fitness loss within these populations. So, as we said before, the job takes a significant toll on the body. We talked about the zero to hero aspect of that. So basically, when officers are on the job, there's a certain level of hypervigilance that they have to maintain safety. I believe it's in the military, is it stay alert, stay alive, right, Rob? So, with that being said, from a biological standpoint, and when you're in a hyper-vigilant state, it's a heightened state of awareness, that's going to make you more prepared for any type of physical or emotional type of threat. So, the problem with that is, like, if you look at the nature of the job, when officers are on the job, they're usually in a constant state of hypervigilance in that state, right? So in small doses, that's a good thing because it helps keep you safe. But when it is chronic and prolonged over time, again, it causes a whole cascade of different health consequences that are a real challenge. So this is Dr. Kevin Gilmartin, great author. He wrote a book, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. He talks about the biological roller coaster as far as what happens when you are on shift and when you roll off shift and kind of, from a biological standpoint, what's going on with the body. So don't worry, this is not going to be a physiology lecture. So, but I do want to go over some basic things here just so we're on the same page with a few aspects and again, get a greater understanding of this. So with that fight or flight response and that hypervigilance, all right? So in order to be prepared for a threat, your body is going to have a cascade of hormonal reactions that are going to allow you to be in a more prepared physiological state. Okay, so when you are hypervigilant, you're going to see an increase in your catecholamines and cortisol levels. All right, so the catecholamines, adrenaline, noradrenaline, what do those do? Do we know? So it elevates physiological function. So you're going to see heart rate go up, respiration rate go up, perspiration rate start to go up. It's going to actually, that along with cortisol, it's going to cause vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. And what that does is that's actually beneficial in acute bouts because that helps, as red blood cell carrying capabilities increase, what that does is that helps push nutrients to the areas that need to be utilized. So basically your working skeletal muscle tissues. So blood flow is going to increase the amount of nutrients going to those areas and provide oxygen to the working skeletal muscles. In opposition of that, what we're also going to see happen is you're going to see an increase in blood glucose into the bloodstream. Okay, now with that being said, you're also going to see an increase, especially over prolonged periods of time, in gluconeogenesis, which basically just means the creation of new glucose. So basically, your body is trying to utilize the energy substrates in your body so you can be prepared to react and respond. So all those things are going to be circulating more through the bloodstream. So for instance, blood sugar levels are going to go up. So the glycogen that we store in the body for activities is going to start to break down from glycogen into blood glucose. It goes into the bloodstream, so it's easily available to use by the body. You'll also see degradation of protein in order to use as an energy source, and also lipolysis will occur. So you'll actually have free fatty acids that will start flowing through the bloodstream as well. So again, that's a really good thing in short bouts because that gives you the required energy you need to handle the situation. It's not good when you're sitting in a car for 10 hours, right? And you're amped up and waiting for something to happen. Okay, in addition to that, what we will also see is reduced in insulin sensitivity. So basically what happens is because you have elevated blood glucose levels over time, that's going to cause a additional shift to your ability to take up that blood sugar and put it back into the muscle tissues to store to utilize again. So this is going to increase your risk of type 2 diabetes as well. With that being said, if you have a high level of blood sugar in the system, when you immediately come off shift, one of the things that also happens, like basically if you don't use that blood sugar, then you're going to start to reuptake that blood sugar. Especially for males, a lot of times that's going to increase the adiposity that surrounds the abdominal tissues. The closer you get to the viscera of the heart and the more fat that's around the viscera of the heart, again, the greater your risk of cardiovascular disease. So again, it kind of creates a biological disaster within the body. It really does. Okay, other things, altered thyroid function is another issue, so that's gonna affect your metabolism. Increased aldosterone, what that does, aldosterone is actually, it's kind of interesting, it sends a signal to the kidneys to release salt into the bloodstream in order to draw water into the bloodstream to increase your plasma level. The reason it does that is to help increase blood pressure and also to help shuttle those nutrients and red blood cells throughout the system. So again, in short bouts, that could be beneficial. However, over time, that can create things like high blood pressure. And then altered growth hormone levels. So some of that also comes along with not only the constant state of stress, but also altered sleep patterns that occur as well. So basically, we recover from these stressors during sleep. If you have altered sleep patterns, then you're not releasing that growth hormone. So that impacts your ability to sustain and maintain muscle mass over time. Which again, what we said before is like, when you're on the job, there is an opportunity for that muscle tissue that you have to actually degrade and be utilized for energy. The problem with that is when that muscle tissue degrades, your metabolism starts to lower because lean muscle tissue is more calorically needy than other tissues in the body. So basically, we start seeing this cycle of unfitness that starts to unfold. Okay, was that good? Too much? All right, fair enough. All right, so as we talked about earlier, this leads to a whole host of different chronic diseases and conditions that to some extent can be prevented with some proactivity. Again, we already know that the job creates the perfect environment to make a dumpster fire, but by implementing a few strategies, then we can help reduce those risks. Okay, also, as individuals become less physically active, the risk of injury goes up as well. So again, a lot of times what we see is they get unfit. All of a sudden, it affects mood state, they're less motivated, as Dr. Lockie talked about earlier, they don't train, and they don't work out. So now, when they do go do something, the risk of being hurt is elevated. So again, creates that slippery slope in that cycle. In addition to that, because exercise does allow for the increase of the good hormones, like your endorphins, that help elevate mood states. If you're not engaging in regular physical activity, then it can have a negative impact on your overall mood, and which leads to anxiety, depression, and overall mental health issues within this population. So if they're not getting that dopamine hit from exercise, unfortunately, a lot of times they get a dopamine hit from other things. That could be, different types of addictions, alcohol, nicotine. Video gaming is a big one that we're seeing a lot of here recently. So if they're not getting it in those ways, they're going to try and find that hit somewhere else. So it can lead to other aspects as far as that can damage their overall wellness over time. And this just kind of speaks to, again, that cycle that we see tend to happen. Okay, so big message here, movement is medicine. So there's a saying that if exercise was a pill, it would be the most heavily prescribed pill on the planet. Because literally every single one of those conditions that we just talked about, it can help with. So everything from the physical aspects to the mental health aspects as well. So when we're talking about trying to improve the fitness of the force, exercise is one of your best strategies. Okay, the big thing, and we talked about the time issues, is everyone wants to know what is the least I can do to get that benefit. So what is the minimum effective dose? So if you are doing as little as 75 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity per week, or 150 minutes of lower level activity, then you can actually reduce your risk of all-cause mortality by a significant amount. With that said, again, literally, we're talking about 15 minutes a day. So it doesn't have to be a huge amount, and also it can be done in chunks, so it doesn't have to be done all at one time. Okay, one other aspect of that too is if you look at maintaining strength, so we know with that natural aging process, strength tends to go down, but what the research has shown is just 3 13-minute sessions per week, performing a weight that will allow you to perform about 8 to 12 repetitions to volitional fatigue. So basically the most that you can do for 8 to 12 reps will help sustain and actually help you improve strength to some extent. Now, If you're somebody who's really concerned about, getting larger muscles, that's gonna take a lot more training. Okay, but just to stay strong, it takes kind of a shockingly small amount to do that. Okay, other studies. So this is looking at improving one rep max strength. So, another study showed that if you do 6 to 12, repetitions with an all-out intensity, you can actually see significant increases in like the squat and bench press in as little as 8 to 12 weeks. So all of that being said, it doesn't take a lot. All right, so one of the best things I would advocate for is as soon as you come off shift, if you can just give it 10 to 15 minutes, get rid of some of that blood sugar that's circulating within your system, that's gonna reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and a lot of those different comorbidities that we talked about. In addition to that, it does have a mood boosting element and state to it as well, okay? Annual fitness testing is another thing that I would recommend. Even, and probably in a best case scenario, annual fitness testing, non-punitive. And the reason that I say that is you don't want to create a situation where it's a run through job situation. Because a lot of times you end up with all kinds of challenges with like different unions and things like that. So at least a non-punitive, mandatory test. And I say mandatory, so basically you just have to come in and take it. I think Dr. Ward talked about this earlier. It's a check engine light soon kind of thing, right? So where are you right now? You came in a year later. This is where you're at. Is there anything you need to work on? So again, it just helps them maintain fitness over time. And the programs that we've worked with that have those non-punitive mandatory programs tend to maintain their fitness better because they know that they're going to have to do something. Not to throw anybody under the bus, but I had a chief one time say, I hate the push-ups. I think they're stupid. I don't want to do them. I'm like, I understand. However, it's part of the assessment. And he's like, well, because I never knew, it's like, I don't do push-ups all year long. And then 2 months before the test, I start doing them. I'm like, well, right, but would you do them at all if it wasn't? I was like, that's fair enough. Okay, so it's, again, it gets them doing something. All right, so doing something is certainly better than doing nothing. Again, that's kind of the win. We're talking about meeting individuals where they are. This is another big challenge. A lot of times you're super fit people who are used to running the first. So usually I think most of the time the criteria for running or being an instructor of fitness in most training academies and agencies, like, hey, you're fit, you're in charge of fitness now. Unfortunately, they don't have the training background that some of your folks have, and they don't know how to modify and scale programs based off the individual. So that's gonna be a critical component. So if you throw in somebody who is unfit into a super high intensity workout, you're gonna break it. And at that point, again, not only is it gonna impact their job, it's gonna impact their overall quality of life as well, which again, downstream effect, mental health, and a whole lot of other challenges as well. So it's really, really gonna be essential that you meet them where they're at. And it may be as easy like just, okay, can you walk 3 times a day for me? Will you take the stairs? And I don't want to say lower your standards or your expectations, because that's a terrible thing to say, but just get them moving and doing something. One last example, I had a fire agency. They had, at the beginning of every shift, they had 1 hour that they could do fitness. And so we had some guys that were probably in this category, really working out hard. And then they had one guy that had a cup of coffee and was walking around the station like this. And they're all just hacked off at him. They're like, yeah, be kidding, like, look at this guy, I'm like, but dude, he's walking. He's not sitting behind a desk. So would I like to see him do more? Sure, but it's something. So I'm like, go out and have a walk with him, walk a little bit faster, he'll follow you, right? So that's, again, meet them where they are and try and make those adjustments. And again, like I said, you got a great team and a great staff. I know that you're on that pathway already. So I think with that said, we get to transition to Melissa now, correct? Or
Yeah,
There we go.
I did have a question for you, more about, like transparency.
yes.
Like, and I guess like public perception.
Yes.
I know that's like a big topic right now, like how can physical fitness help improve, the perception of law enforcement officers and, with reinforced trust?
Oh, wow. So very quick, Rob.
You have another day.
Go ahead. All right. So I think anecdotally speaking, I mean, again, I don't have research to back this up, but in general terms, I think, from a fitness standpoint, I mean, these are the people who are responsible for public safety, right? And it's one of those things where, from a public safety perspective, like I want to know that the individual who is coming to help is fit enough to do the essential job tasks that are required for them. So I think, I wouldn't say you have to look the part necessarily, but at the same time, you've got to be you need to look like you take care of yourself. I guess that might be a good way to say it.
Yeah, and I think it fits to your point beforehand, where you said, if they're sloppy in their fitness, they're sloppy in other things. If you see somebody, that looks like they don't know what they're doing, you're not gonna have confidence in the fact that they do know what they're doing. And I think physical perception is critical. The classic example is, here in the US, a couple of months ago, they had that actress who was doing CSI. And she was, they were filming her, she was dressed as an officer, and she was doing something, and a little girl got lost. And she ran up to her because she thought she was a police officer, she's there to help. That physical perception of competence and professionalism is critical. Because if you think somebody can, I don't want to say catch you and take you down if you do something stupid, but catch you and take you down if you do something stupid, you're going to be less likely to take them on. If you here deliberately picks a fight with the person that looks like they're going to, make you wish you selected a different life choice, you don't. And there's a reason for that.
And there is some research behind that shows that offenders can gauge their likelihood to either assault the officer or try to flee based on the perception of the officer's level of fitness. So that goes to that officer safety and wellness component, right? Do we want to, like, when we talk about command presence in an academy, that all goes to that perception piece of, do we really want to engage in this right now, or am I going to flee, or what? So it has a direct impact on officer safety in those physical day-to-day, potentially physical interactions that happen day-to-day with officers.
I have a quick question to tie the motivation part with some of what's being talked about. Have you seen, or could you structure, and maybe this is the traffic light system that you were describing, could you structure a screen or a test or an assessment that would be only for the individual, let's say, that could serve as a motivator? In which, you compare yourself against the rest of your peers, and, if you see you're like, I'm here, you kind of go, oh, maybe I'll start doing more.
Yeah, well, and we actually do that. So we'll have it where we'll actually do percentile rankings. So basically, here's where you are, and here's how you kind of stack up to your peers as well. So it's a motivational factor on two levels. So one, as the individual, like, are you making personal progress? And then to kind of see, where do you rank essentially?
Yeah, I think that's important when you're interpreting like ranking stuff. Because if you come in and it's like, oh, you're in the bottom 20%, oh, that sucks. I feel bad about that. But if you can track that individual and go, okay, you were 20, now you're 40, still improvement, improvement needed, but hey, we're on track and this is a good thing. So I think to that point is also individualizing it to the person too. I think that's because if you have your carbon copy fitness testing, which a lot of cases, is done, sorry, I call these ones, but if you know that someone has a certain limitation, like, is there something where we can, if you're reporting a certain injury, can we track? Is there an assessment that we can use that shows your recovery from that? That's a good thing. If you've got someone that's like, okay, you've got your standard one, but it's like, you know what, I really want to improve my bench. All right, cool, let's target that. And so in addition to all these other things, we've got something that you really want to improve. We will help you do that. And that's the buy-in too. So it's true, like the motivation piece is very challenging, I think.
And I think to your point is, you really, what if someone thinks, I'm down in the 5%, man, I got no hope of going up. So it's critical to look at, are we looking at, again, external motivators, or we call homo economicus? We think because everybody knows we should eat better, right? But we all have a burger occasionally, or pizza, or something that we shouldn't do. We know we should. So maybe looking at what are those barriers to that, right? So looking at that deeper dive into motivation, looking at what are those internal motivators? What are we doing to help people identify what those internal barriers are, the internal motivators are, and then what are those levers that can be used to shift that behavior? Because, we can assume, hey, we both want to work on bench. We want to hit that top 5%. That's what we want to do. But maybe there's other folks in that group who don't want that same output, right? But we're assuming they do because that's our frame of reference. So again, meeting them where they are, doing that more holistic assessment, and really examining, is my idea of motivation the same for everybody, or what are the differences? How do we identify barriers? How do we identify countermeasures to the barriers to help with that internal motivation? Because that's that long-term behavior change that everybody's looking for.
And sometimes it's just measuring that behavior change, like what Dr. Dawes was
Showing
talking
progress.
about. It's like you might not have any major changes in fitness, but all of a sudden you've got someone who's now exercising twice a week and they weren't exercising twice a week before. Okay, that is progress, because now we've got something that we can work on. And so I think that's the other piece too, because if you just purely look at some of the fitness data, it's like, all right, you're not improving at all. this is not working, but it's like, have we actually had some type of behavior change? Where you've gone from, I hate exercise to, I see some value in it and now I'm doing it. And even if it's just like, I went for a walk with my partner. That's what I did after I got home. Like, and that's a way in which you overcome the barrier of I don't have time, I've got family commitments. Now you're doing something with your family while also doing something beneficial for you as an individual.
I think Apple Fitness have done it well.
Mhm.
What they've got is those activity trackers where they show, by the way, you're now walking less this month than you have in the last 2 months. If you increase your time walking by just 5 minutes per day, you'll reverse this trend in 3 weeks. So not only is it identifying the change in the trend, but it's telling you and helping you fix it. Because quite often you tell the officer, oh, you're losing fitness. Oh, that sucks. I better get my fitness up. Oh yeah, I don't know what to do. I've never been to the gym. A GYM? What's a GYM? No, I'm out. But it gives you well, you know what? Just do this. 5 minutes extra a day. Oh yeah, I could do that. I want to see this ring change. I mean, it's an amazing bit of manipulation. I'll be up at 11:30 at night going, damn, I haven't closed my move ring. I better go jump on the treadmill downstairs. I mean, who the hell does that that has a normal frame of reference? I wouldn't otherwise. But for me, I'm getting an intrinsic dopamine hit because I closed my mood ring 1 minute to midnight. Boom, baby. You know, it's intrinsically getting me to do something because I'm being given an extrinsic reward that actually costs nothing because it's fake, it's digital. It's not costing Apple anything, but it's having an impact on me by giving me a goal and telling me how to take care of myself. I'm sure other things do it better, but that's just my addiction.
Yeah, no, it's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
I think we should move on, because I'm looking at time
Yeah,
and we need a chance to the other speakers.
yeah, I did have a question for Melissa, actually. So just on the topic of motivation, have you noticed a change in motivation, for recruits in the academy, like from getting to the end? And I guess like, do you like track that, in terms of like outcomes?
I don't know, that's kind of in my
Oh, yeah.
presentation, so if we wanna go to that, we can,
Yeah,
but,
sure.
yeah. Do you want me to go, or
Yes.
did you,
Where's the clicker?
Thank-
Okay.
Whoever was next.
I don't know.
think
Do you want me
Brianna-
to dive in
I
or?
think
or
Brianna's
second?
presentation was next.
Oh, then
Yeah.
you can go.
Yeah.
and we can
If you're
visit
gonna
that.
touch on it.
We'll touch on it.
Okay,
Right.
that sounds good.
And do you have Nico?
Oh, let's see.
Yes.
There we go. All right. So again, thank you for inviting me here. I'm super excited to be here. And this is a fantastic opportunity to learn so much of what's in the academic research, literature, information, studies that have been done. It's not every day that you have that opportunity. So thank you to everyone else that's sitting on the other side of the table. But myself, my name is Brianna Britt. I'm the Deputy Director of Civil Service Unit, not the commission. They're two different entities. And I basically oversee all of the testing, pre-employment testing that occurs within our public safety titles for civil service jobs. And one of those tests is our pre-employment physical ability test. So as I start diving in here, I do want to kind of situate things a little bit around Massachusetts, because the process can be a little bit confusing. So when candidates are interested in being a police officer, they may find out one of a million ways. They apply to take our police officer examination, and that is actually a multiple choice online examination that occurs at a testing location. And they go through that examination. If they pass that test, then they continue in the process and are put on an eligible list. That from that eligible list, municipalities across Massachusetts will say, oh, you know, I need 3 officers. Go to that eligible list. There's a certification protocol formula. They have their candidates, and then they can start their background checks, medical examination, and the physical ability test comes in at that juncture. So I think it's helpful just to kind of set the outline of time frame of how this works. And it was mentioned earlier in terms of this process can be very long. It absolutely can. From the moment that somebody says, oh, I want to be a police officer, to actually getting to the physical ability test, to getting hired and then going to the academy, it can take quite the time. A few months is really expedited. A couple of years could definitely be the time frame that we're looking at. So the motivation factor, I think, really is significant because trying to hold that motivation and engagement throughout the process really is significant. So with that backdrop, pre-employment testing for police officers, we do with multiple choice testing, but also with the physical ability test. And we heard a little bit earlier in terms of different style physical ability tests, and the style that we utilize is very much an occupational test. So it's a simulation-based physical ability test that covers multiple events that are done on the job. And I'll talk a little bit about our task analysis in the next slide. That's how we came up with those particular events. I was going to share the video, but based on time, I'm gonna skip the video. Just for everyone to know, you can view the video online on Civil Service's website. There's a video that's very much geared towards candidates, giving them a concept, a preview of what to expect when they go through the physical ability test. So if you're interested in seeing what it is very much available online. I do have the link in here, but you can navigate to it pretty easily through the Civil Service website. There really are just 3 events that we include in that scenario-based testing. The first is the obstacle course, and it does, you do have to keep a fairly quick pace of running through the obstacle course, but there are different events throughout that obstacle course that somebody needs to be able to navigate to complete that course within the required time frame. So we do have a wall that was extensively identified through our task analysis and size, structure, whatnot. There is a window, there's uneven terrain that someone has to navigate through. There's a whole bunch of different pieces, agility conduits that give a candidate a taste of different types of events that they may encounter on the job. And all of that came from data from existing police officers. So there's that event. There is the separation or control event. There's been a lot of talk around that short burst of energy to separate individuals, to handle a situation in a very noteworthy way at that moment for a short period of time. And we do have an event that simulates that. Again, timed, you have to finish the event within the time window that is prescribed. And then we have the dummy drag that, again, we've talked about multiple times, and you have to drag that dummy a certain distance within the time limit that is specified. So one thing to note that might be obvious at this point, but I'm going to call it out. With an occupational test, we're measuring scenarios that are tied to aspects of the job. Now, that job is the same for everyone. So everybody has the same cut standard for each of these events, whether you're male, female, 20, 40, it's all the same. Now, understanding that candidates do have to pass all these events, each one is timed, they have to pass all the events, but they do have multiple opportunities to take the test. 2 opportunities per each conditional offer. So if they say the town of Mansfield says, oh, I want Joe Schmo to work for me, and goes through the hiring process for Mansfield, but doesn't pass the test, they can try again. If they don't pass that test, then that limits their opportunity for that hiring round for Mansfield. But Danvers may say, oh, hey, I really want that Joe Schmo. Okay, then you have your opportunity for the physical ability test for that municipality. So there is an opportunity, if you fail the test, to take it again or to take it with a different municipality. And again, I'm going to skip the video, but you can look at it online. I think it really is helpful to set your understanding of what the course is. The other thing with the course itself is we have a preview for all of our candidates where you can see the test online, right? And that gives you a visual of it. But in the world of physical ability testing, it's really helpful to physically see the events and feel the events. So what we do is a preview day. Everybody that is scheduled to take the test, we invite them to come early, like a couple weeks early, and say, here is the event. Walk through the event. get a sense of the wall, get a sense of the window. Walk over that uneven terrain, understand what each of the pieces are and get a feel for them so that you're familiar with each aspect before you take the actual. So there's a lot of pieces in the process, from our physical ability prep guide that we have available free to everyone online for all the candidates, to the video that you can see online, to the preview, to actually taking the test. So it is quite a lengthy process in terms of making sure everybody knows what they're taking, because it is kind of a unique test. If you're not familiar with it, you wouldn't know. Our testing, we actually collaborate with a vendor named Talogy. They're an industrial organizational psychology vendor, similar background as myself with industrial organizational psychology, but they just have a lot more background, research, data, similar to the individuals on the other side of the table here, in terms of understanding some of these physical aspects and the process. And the way that we created this test, gosh, it is such a process. It is a long process. And all the head nods on the other side of the table here. But it's a really good process, because we started out this process. It did take, it was funny, I think the average time was mentioned 3 years. Yeah, it took us about 3 or 4. It takes quite an amount of time, but we started with focus groups and really understanding what are the challenges, what are the concerns, what are the different groups that may have concerns, what should we look into, what are the perceptions matter too, like what are all those pieces. Then we created multiple surveys to understand what are the tasks being done in the job. And we cover police officers across the state, right? So you have somebody in Boston, it's in this very much city environment, and then you have some very small towns out in Western Mass that are in a very different environment. And during that survey process, we made sure to get representation from small towns, big cities, and geographical representation. Western Mass, Southern, Northern, city, coastal, inland, just so that we gathered an understandable sample of individuals. Also, oversampling minority populations. So the ethnic minorities, diversity, gender, age, as much as possible, right? And really getting that representative sample, which is challenging, but incredibly useful just to have that data. We also did a supplemental survey on physical events, things that you have to do that are physical in nature, and getting down to the nitty-gritty of those details, because we know that the job of a police officer does have physical aspects. But in Massachusetts, what are those physical aspects in one town versus another? And having that data is absolutely crucial to the process. So once we have all that data, then we can work to identify what events might be pertinent. How could we situate those events in something like an obstacle course? Then at the end of the process, it's really a pilot test to have folks run through the course and give us feedback on it and understand, okay, so these are incumbents running through the course. What did they find challenging? Was it representative of the job that they do on a day-to-day basis? Was it not representative for them? And what wasn't? Was it more difficult? Was it easier? We did a lot of follow-up and feedback with those pilot testers to understand a lot of those details. So the process of the job analysis and the revalidation process is absolutely crucial whenever we're creating a test for anything. And physical ability is just a little different than some of the other exams, but the same concepts really apply. And we, through our job analysis process, were able to set cut scores and make sure that we set a minimum qualification cut, because we want to make sure that the exam is job related and it's based on minimum qualifications. That is the absolute minimum that somebody should have in terms of their ability to get hired. Then they'll learn how to do the job at the academy once they get to that juncture. Outside of that, yes, and I mentioned that candidates have two chances for each conditional offer to go through the test, so nobody's banned from the test, even if you fail, right? You can always try to come back, when you get the opportunity with another municipality. So I tried to go through that pretty quickly. Did we have questions on?
Have you seen officers like get stuck in the physical ability like test phase, you know, like they pass the multiple choice exam and like background check, but the 2 times they take it, like they don't pass? Have you seen anything?
It is rare,
Okay.
but possibility of that occurring.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it really depends on someone's physical fitness, ability coming in the door. We try to tell people at open houses even. We'll meet up and do an open house for a police officer exam. And what I tell them at that open house, which might be 6 months before they take the multiple choice exam, is, okay, so understand the process. Here are prep guides for the multiple choice exam, physical ability test, and what you can do right now is get in shape. And they're like, what? That comes so far down the road. I'm like, start now. Because it's not something that's gonna happen overnight, especially if individuals are used to, their concept of a marathon is a movie marathon, not actually running anything, right? It's just in the culture today, people aren't all that active. And so giving them a heads up early in the process to be active and do something, is really the key. And that's what we see in terms of if people get to the physical ability test, they're like, I don't do anything physical. Well, yeah, it's gonna be more difficult for them. But I would say the rates are quite low in terms of folks that don't pass the 2 attempts. Often if somebody's not too familiar, maybe they didn't look at the prep guide, they don't know what to expect, they didn't show up to the preview. And they're like, oh, I have to run that? Oh, I wasn't thinking I had to do all of that. And that might take them by surprise, so they might pass in the second try. Possibility.
Just like to be conscious of time, Melissa, did you want to go? And
Sure.
don't want to rush.
I talk fast, so it's fine. Okay, there's a lot of information on here, and I know we're talking about incumbents, but from my perspective, we should start with the knowledge of fitness and health and how to go through that process at day 1 in the academy. And that's establishing a culture of wellness and also giving them the tools that they're going to need when they leave the academy. So that's going to be huge. If you have a wellness program or if you have testing or whatever it is, that they leave the academy with those tools. They don't just like wake up one day and have to know all of this information. Because again, it's our job to teach them these tools, and there's a physical aspect to their job, and also high death rates and mortality and obesity and all these things. And as you can see from my little pie chart, they have to be able to do a lot of things. Strength, speed, tons of skill, from marksmanship to all of these different things. They need to be mobile. They need to be able to eat well. They have a 12-hour shift. Are they eating all day or are they not eating? Are they prepared at the end of the 12-hour shift to have a critical incident? So to me, establishing that culture of wellness has to start in the academy. And then hopefully continue through, and I'll get into why the academic community is important, so that we can do research on, hey, are they using those tools when they leave, and are they applying them in, you know, as incumbents? So establishing that culture of wellness. I'm fairly new to the MPTC. I worked in Washington, DC for many years. I spent a lot of years boots on the ground working with recruits as strength coach. So I do bring that expertise. And like you said, I think if you're gonna reach out to anyone, it should be someone who understands that world. If that's, you know, in the department area. So what we did is, and I'll get into why the academic world helped me in this, but I knew coming into it that we needed to make some changes on how the recruits were learning, fitness and health and nutrition. So with the help of others, we vetted what we currently had, and we are going to be rolling out a new curriculum, which took, quite a bit of time, but we will be piloting it, in December at one academy. So we're going to train all the instructors, who will be working with the recruits, but we realized that we were giving them all this information up front. And as you know, if you've worked in an academy setting, that is the most stressful time in the academy when they arrive. So they're not gonna retain this knowledge throughout their career. So what we did was look at it and say, okay, we need to be teaching this throughout the academy. Week one needs to be a different process, really not hitting on much other than why do you need to be physically active as a police officer? So, and you guys touched on that, but they need to know why they are going through this process. Why do you need to be fit? So what are the physical job demands of a police officer? Why do I need to be, I always hear this, well, on the job, you don't stretch before you go and chase someone. Well, I realize that, but have you been working on your mobility leading up to that? Because if you haven't, you're going to get an injury. So all of that ties in, but you have to explain why you're doing it. So once they know the physical job demands, and also there are injury risks that are specific to law enforcement, they need to know what that is. So if a traditional academy setting is come in, do what I say, pass the test, see you later. And we want to change that environment and that culture to where we are teaching them these skills, instead of just demanding it. This should be a way of life. So like I said, this is our new curriculum in the short of it. So coming into the academy, and I love the Army using readiness or the word preparedness. That again is our job, to prepare you for your job. You need to be ready. And if I'm just making you do it without an explanation of why, just like marksmanship, I wouldn't, and I know you talked about this too, I wouldn't say, just go do it and no reason why. And exercise is a skill, as we know. So when you get the general population coming into an academy, something that seems common sense to me is not common sense to them. They don't know where to start to run. They don't know nutrition. They weren't taught these things. And as we know, like my own daughter, she only does PE twice a week for 45 minutes. That's it. So I make her do more on, outside of that. But they don't know that coming into it. And yes, state by state's a little different. I see a difference here than I did in DC, and I worked with cadets who grew up in that city, and the way they ate is they showed up in the morning with a bag of Doritos. So again, I wouldn't say, give me the Doritos and all this stuff. I'm gonna teach them what nutrition is. So as we progress through the academy, it'll look kind of like that. And I notice a lot of nutritional issues coming into the academy, so I want to address that right away. So that'll be week one, and that's learning, like, what do carbohydrates do for me? What do carbohydrates do for me when I've been working all day and now I'm showing up to a critical incident? How do I recover? You can recover with proper nutrition too. So performance, basics of nutrition. And then we get into a little bit of injury prevention is all of this, but I know it's easier when you say injury prevention. So that's explaining to the recruits what are acute and chronic injuries. And again, in the academy setting, all of them know these chronic injuries in an academy are a little bit different than an incumbent. So again, right out of the gate, we want to teach the recruits, what are the chronic issues? And a lot of it is coming in unfit, barely being able to get into the academy, and they crammed for the test. So they're coming in with some chronic injuries, and then the traditional way of academy training with just running and calisthenics, it exacerbates those chronic injuries. So again, we looked at the training models, and we have to look at the entire state. So we did kind of a pilot program where, again, you've got to track your injuries, you got to track the data coming in. So looking at a traditional setting and then kind of implementing really simple concepts like, hey, have some strength days and power days, and then some endurance days instead of every day being a run day. And then you saw the injuries just, come way down. And what a concept, now we're adding strength and power, which are huge, being a police officer. So just changing the culture and the mindset, which is difficult at times in this space. But it can be done, and it has to start day one in the academy. So a lot of changes we made. I just went over the curriculum, using evidence-based best practices instead of perception. There's a lot of perception in training, and it has to be based on current evidence-based best practices. Like you brought up stress and cumulative stress and adaptation. So what does that look like? And with fitness coming into a traditional academy, everyone expects you to be fit right then and there. No, we have to give them time to adapt to the process. We have to factor in the stress of the academy, the instructors, what's going on, is there testing? So program design for job demands and injury risks, training volume. So again, when you have, I think you brought this up also, like, oh, hey, you run a lot, you seem in shape, you're gonna go run the entire program. But in a subject matter expert's world, you're like, holy crap, that would be insane. You'd have to map it out, okay, and go through an adaptation process with overload and all these things. So it's important that you have subject matter experts doing the programming and understanding training volume. So taking the traditional academy and the training volume is so high and intense in the beginning, which is the complete opposite of what we would teach in the strength and conditioning world. So we've updated the physical training instructor certification. We brought in nationally recognized certification through the National Strength and Conditioning Association, which all of these fine gentlemen have contributed to. And we brought in the tactical strength and conditioning course. Most of the state has been certified. We have another one in February. So just updating the knowledge for everyone from the recruit level to the instructor level. We also, our staff instructors, it's two different instructors, kind of, I guess, would be like a drill instructor. But also involving them in the process and making sure they understand what the job demands are, what the injury risks are. We do teach a little bit of human physiology, periodization, and then they understand the process of program design too. So again, if we're constantly from every direction teaching the recruits about this, they're going to leave the academy, be able to pack their lunch that day. They're gonna know when they walk in the gym how to program for themselves. So if you have specificity of training, and again, I think you brought this up, you can teach them to put a workout together in 15 minutes. So they understand those concepts. So I'll move on. And again, data-driven decision-making is huge. So collecting injury information. If I didn't know what the injuries were at certain academies and looking for trends and things like that, I wouldn't know how to make my decisions. That has to happen at a department level as well. So if one department has high amount of, I don't know why, but in DC, it was like people slamming their hand in the car door when they were running to, it was bizarre, but I'm like, what the heck? So, but you have to keep track of that and understand injury trends within the department. And it can be simple, like Joe said, mine, it sucks. I hate Excel, but it's an Excel program. And it's like upper, lower extremity, what happened? Did they go to the hospital? Was first aid used? What are the and they're one-offs, but if you see a real trend, hey, everyone's getting lower extremity injuries at this one academy, they're obviously probably high volume running, So again, you need people that understand the process to develop and run those programs, but academic and subject matter involvement in police training, I think is crucial and has helped me develop as a professional, and you guys have a great panel here today. In the state of Massachusetts, we have great subject matter experts, Dr. Tinda Sivak, who's worked in the tactical community and research and all of that herself, helped us develop the recruit curriculum and the staff instructor curriculum. And they did have a police academy, which was awesome too, at their specific college at Merrimack, which some of you probably know. So they were able to research and do testing on the recruits they had there. So they did power tests, you know, all kinds of stuff. And then the nutrition grad students would come in and develop programs for them. So it was just great to gain their knowledge and all of that. So they helped with the nutrition portion of the curriculum as well. We also brought in subject matter experts who worked in policing from a mental health standpoint, come in and work on a resilience curriculum because it's all encompassing fitness, nutrition, the mental aspect. So working with the academic community, mental health is not my scope of practice. I wouldn't go and write a mental health curriculum. I would bring in experts to do that and help me with that. From my experiences with recruits, I give that aspect of it, what I think we probably need, and then they helped develop that. So, these partnerships also kind of take out the organizational influence. So like I sit at my agency, are there influences from the organization that are driving the decisions? But once you bring in the experts, that's just what it is. This is what's current. These are evidence-based best practices based on research. So it kind of takes the perception of things and all of that stuff out of it. And also it implements ongoing research in the field to further evidence-based practices. So having that partnership, like with Tinda, we're trying to get a grant to see, hey, does this work? And kind of follow those people, the recruits, into their career and see if it's actually working or not. Hopefully that goes through, we'll see. So to me, in this, and it's fairly new from what I can tell as far as the research that has been going on, but it's great. It's helped a lot of people. So I think it's absolutely important. And it also just brings in 21st century policing, you know, that kind of gets rid of that outdated training methods. I'm going fast enough. Here's our subject matter experts. I want to give them a shout out, so you can look at that if you want. A huge component of this is leadership involvement. If leadership is not involved or they poo-poo it, it will not happen. That is the only driving factor in this, and it's from every level, even the leadership as an instructor to a recruit. If they are telling you something different or not on board with the process, it will not work. So gaining that buy-in, and with that, it's the knowledge around it. That is how you gain buy-in. So it's a key role in driving a culture shift towards mental and physical health support. Leadership also needs to model healthy behaviors. So if you have leadership who they're always working, they're not sleeping, they're terrible at their own nutrition and mental health and all these things, compared to a leadership is like, hey, I got problems too, but I'm doing all these things and very open. The culture is different. So a leadership culture is very crucial in this process and the process that you're about to go through. So departments across the nation are struggling to hire, as we all know. That's everywhere, and also in the military. So I think there are some departments that are doing really great. They're not giving $50,000 bonuses, which some states are doing. They're changing their internal methods. And it's not checking a box, it's not smoke and mirrors. They're really changing their internal methods as far as wellness, the incentives they're providing their officers, and really retaining them. Because back in the day, it was, I'm a police officer, I'm going to refer my son, my daughter, all the people in the neighborhood and all these things because the culture at the department is good. So that drives hiring too. So make sure you're taking care of your people, at the department level and providing wellness benefits. And again, the status quo is not working to help officers deal with growing operational, issues, family pressures, the stressors, complex work environment. And so the changing culture can help drive wellness and make it a part of their life instead of do this test or do this. It has to be a holistic, approach to it. So that's my 2 cents. And see, look, I talk fast, I told you.
So quick comment, you're doing amazing work.
Yeah.
Like, that's outstanding. I mean, that's so far ahead of what most programs are doing, so kudos to you for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
That's amazing.
And thank you all, because I refer to your research and, use it a lot to present ideas, so thank you.
Well, this is great. Is there any parting thoughts or question from anybody? I think, this has been a great discussion. Oh, please.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious. So going way back to the beginning with the job task analysis, I know a lot of the work has been done on understanding the physical requirements for law enforcement, but I'm curious if there's been any work done so far on the psychological and social requirements of the job.
I think that would be on there's quite a lot on the psychological and the cognitive piece. You look at a lot of so MMPI was a common assessment that was used. I think every state has a different selection battery or criteria that they might recommend. And then every agency might do something in addition to that. So for example, there's a lot of variation on, is a polygraph required? Yes or no? Does it depend on some of the key things in the background investigation? So there's a lot of psychometric instruments in there, as well as those cognitive instruments for reading comprehension or other things. So each state's a little different in how involved they choose to get into it. And then within that, each agency of the 18,000 plus agencies has a different amount of involvement in that process. So that's really that kind of that federalist system that we live in that allows each state to set those standards. And then typically a lot of organizations will exceed those state minimum standards with something else that they want to do. So there's really kind of no standard question like, is assessment A used? That yes, but then also assessment B, C, D, and F are used too. So it all depends on which entity. Typically the larger agencies tend to be more resourced in those areas. So those agencies that have maybe 5,000 officers or more, they may have those other initial assessments. So that might be a place to look because they just have the financial resources of large agencies to be able to look at some of those other pieces in their assessment process. So many agencies might use a common state written exam, but some agencies may also develop their own written exam. And the state statute enables them to use that written exam as long as it's been validated instead of the state minimum written exam. So again, there's a wide diversity. So kind of state by state, and then within that, okay, who are the agencies in the state that are, what's the consensus of those entities within a state?
Yeah, thank you.
I think one of the agencies doing it the best in Australia are the specialist elements because they have more ongoing training. I think one thing we need to remember is the psychometrics that we use need to adapt to the population we're now dealing with. We can't base them on older methodologies that we've used that fit our metrics, the way we view the world, as opposed to those we're trying to recruit. Their metrics, the way they think, the way they, obviously, you can't multitask, it's impossible. You task switch. The speed at which they task switch is very different to the speed at which we task switch. Their computer and digital literacy is very different to ours. And that's where the future is going with, drone technology, etc. We're talking about law enforcement officers now having, almost like a military battle management system to control multiple drones, to identify friend or foe. Look at Germany, they're sending in drones now with paramedic supplies so they can get through traffic. the law enforcement officer is an event and they see this drone, how they're gonna react. You know, digital literacy and the way we view the world in the future, we need to make sure we're recruiting that population now with the skill sets that they're gonna need when they're qualified and they're on the job. So we just have to be very cautious of using old psychometrics as the current standard, and we need to constantly adapt, just like we do physicality, psychometrically as well.
Thank you.
Melissa, the new curriculum, will it have anything on like digital literacy or, you know, learning how to use new technologies as they come out?
So we have a lot of rules, I guess, for recruits, so they don't even have their phones on them in the academy. So even, like, we purchased a new program, I have pilot programs all the time, so I'm piloting this one. And it was kind of based on like Smartabase. I don't have access to that, it's too expensive, but when they get home doing digital survey on their readiness, are they sleeping, did they eat enough, all of those things. I do give resources as far as, you know, if they have a hard time with program. I think Bolt's a great resource, it kind of does all the programming for them, so I'll give them some resources, but that's how they access information. And so sometimes I'll give them free resources they can use and stuff like that, but even just going home and doing this survey, it all dumps into a database for me, and I can gauge and see how a recruit is doing in a certain academy. Like I just noticed they weren't really eating at all. And I highlighted in green or red or anything like that, so I can just see it right away. And then you can kind of make adjustments, that way. And most, I think, fitness apps do that, like Bolt does the readiness check-in. So, hey, you're really screwed up, you're stressed out, I'm gonna change your programming for that day. So using data, that way is crucial in the way you, program, especially for recruits or even incumbent, just anyone in the whole entire world. If you have a stressful week, am I gonna go and do my 1 rep max bench press? Probably not. I'm probably gonna do something easy and work on mobility or something different. So the data can drive how you change your program as far as fitness, goes. So I don't know if that
I
answers
think
the
one of
question, but
the data, I think hopefully nothing's a silver bullet, right?
yeah.
One size doesn't fit all. And there's the data, there's the science, and there's the art form of coaching, right? And assisting and helping
Right.
develop people. Just like we wouldn't put somebody through a 3-week SWAT school and then expect them to be a tier 1 operator right away. There's a mentorship process in there. There's experiences that need to happen within that. So just because someone went to a class, we don't, in any other disciplines, we don't expect them to be an immediate expert, right? The other piece of the technology and all the other things are, part of the discussion can be, what are those resources that we're willing to put into this to support this? So she mentioned some technology solutions. They slide on a scale, but they provide a ton of different information. One of the projects that we were involved in, the cost per recruit broke down to about $60 per recruit. And we were able to provide a massive amount of support to the instructors, support to program design, support to daily readiness assessment, which could help identify potential injury risk. And where things like this come into play is we'll never have enough instructors as we would like to in any of these capacities. So with looking at some of that daily readiness data, we can identify where's the most likely group that might be injured. So if we have a class of 50 or 100 recruits, what are the 20 that we really need to focus on because they're not as recovered or they had some pre-existing things coming in? Because what we found is just looking at how they come in is one thing. The other piece is how are they responding to training on a daily basis? So someone can come in really poor, but they're responding okay, they're adapting okay, they're recovering okay. But someone might come in at a high fitness level, might not be adapting okay. So it's a combination of those two elements, and we wouldn't have known that unless we had that incoming data and we were looking at the daily readiness data component of it. So, you know, we're spending money on vehicles, we're spending money on computers. Part of that discussion should be, what are we spending on program support for these kinds of things, for the instructor piece, for the data piece, because that really helps manage that recovery component of it and the training load. And we saw much better successes when we did that. We saw injuries go down, completion rates went up, attrition went down. Well, in fact, one of the more revolutionary studies through Georgia Public Safety Training Centers for 9 of the 20 academies across Georgia. It was a longitudinal study of about a year and a half. Every element went in the right direction. So body fat went down, grip strength went up, speed got better, repetitions got better. All the elements were statistically significant. We were astounded because it was 9 sites around the state. And we said, okay, something's gotta be wrong, something, and we said it to a couple of different biostatisticians. We said, try and break the model, try and find out what's going on that doesn't matter. They couldn't, they said, no, the program is working as intended. And so there's a combination of instructor support, technology, and different components to it. But that particular program broke down to about $66 per recruit. So when you look at the increased throughput, the reduction in injuries, and again, statistically significant positive direction, then we also measured what they liked about exercise, their intention to continue to exercise. And we also infused some resiliency training, interleaving it with physical fitness and defensive tactics training. So how likely were they to engage in mindfulness practices moving forward? So we gauged all of those things, which again, gave us a great place to work from, but it required some resources to do that. But when you look at the return on investment, it's massive. And again, that's just one of probably 50,000 different ways to do it. It's just one of the more well-researched ones at the moment.
I think an important point about the tech, like there's a lot of cool technology that's out there. But what are you gonna do with it? Like, that's the question you have to ask. Because you can collect, and I had this conversation with one of my former grads who's worked with the police department. It's like, we want to get a whole bunch of heart rate monitors. Cool, what are you gonna do with it? Well, we're gonna measure them. Okay, great. Then, like, where's it gonna go?
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's important. Like, you gotta have a plan. Like, you can collect this data, but if it doesn't go anywhere, and if the personnel, the individual doesn't see it again, they're not gonna care.
Yeah,
Like,
it has to drive the decision.
it's exactly,
Yeah.
like, it's gotta be used for something.
Yeah, but even having, and we did this in DC, every officer gets a work phone. It's already embedded with the wellness program. They can track their workouts. I think it was Cortico or something to that effect. Even wellness, mental health practices and things like that. So it's embedded in the phone. They don't have to do anything. It's on there for them 24/7.
Well, and I think to Joe's point too, so for $6,600, you can give that to 100 cadets versus losing one, it's 170,000.
Yeah, right.
So
I know.
cost wise, it's kind of,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I hate to break up this great discussion, but we're over time, and there's a group that's coming in afterwards, so they may need a little bit more setup time. But thank you very much, everybody, for your participation. Thank you, Lizzie, Joe, everybody, for putting it together. This was a great discussion. We take away the tape of all of these great takeaways and presentation, and we might have to have you back for some kind of a follow-up at some point. But again, thank you, everybody. I think this was a great discussion.
Joe, I do have